All right, let's dive right into today's news. Buckle up, it's a pretty packed day across the globe. We've got a lot to cover, from tremors in Myanmar to rumblings in France, plus some serious developments in Gaza. And of course, we'll touch on what's shaking things up on the home front here in the US and across the markets.
Sounds like a plan. Let's start with that earthquake in Myanmar.
Right, Myanmar. Over the weekend, they got hit by a 7.7 earthquake, and, well, things aren't looking good.
The initial numbers are all over the place, which always makes things tricky. The military government is saying about 2,000 casualties, but the U.S. Geological Survey, they're estimating it could be more like 10,000. Pretty massive difference, right?
Yeah, that's a huge gap. Makes you wonder what's going on over there, especially since, this is the same military government that's been known to downplay things in the past.
Exactly. And they're not exactly making things easy for anyone trying to get the real picture. They've been restricting access for foreign journalists, so getting independent verification is tough.
So we're relying on whatever trickles out from neighboring countries like Thailand. Okay, well, let's shift gears to Europe. What's the latest in France?
Well, Marine Le Pen, major figure in French politics, just got hit with a guilty verdict for embezzling EU funds.
Wow, embezzlement. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it comes with a 5-year ban from holding office, which basically throws a wrench in her plans for the 2027 presidential election.
So she's out of the running.
Potentially, yeah. It's not just the ban either. She also got a 4-year prison sentence, but 2 years of that are suspended while she appeals. A lot of people in French politics didn't see this coming.
Interesting. And what about her party, the National Rally? How are they taking it?
They held an emergency meeting,
Hmm.
and Le Pen herself said she's definitely appealing, fighting to clear her name.
This whole thing is kind of ironic because the law she got snagged on about misusing public funds, it was actually toughened up recently by some of the same politicians who are now criticizing this whole situation. So a law they supported is now being used against them. It does make you think about the unintended consequences of, strengthening laws like that. What happens when the political winds change, right?
Right. And it's hard to say what the long-term impact will be on the national rally. I mean, this verdict could fire up their base in the short term, feed into this idea that they're victims of the system, but without Le Pen at the helm, their appeal in the broader election might take a hit.
I see what you mean, and I guess we'll have to wait and see if anyone else steps up to fill her shoes, or if this opens the door for other right-wing figures to try and make a move.
Yeah, exactly. It's all very much up in the air right now. It's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the situation in Gaza. The U.S. has weighed in, saying all parties involved should, follow international humanitarian law, but it's unclear if they're actually going to investigate the recent incident where the Israeli military killed 15 people.
Yeah. This incident on March 23rd is pretty disturbing. We're talking about paramedics, civil defense workers, even a UN official. The UN's report is saying 5 ambulances, a fire truck, and a UN vehicle all got hit. And these weren't stray shots. They were hit one after another.
It's hard to imagine how that could be anything but intentional.
It's definitely raising some serious questions. The Israeli military statement is that their forces fired on vehicles that were advancing suspiciously, claiming they didn't have lights or signals and that a Hamas operative and some other militants were among the dead.
But even if that were true, how does that justify the loss of so many humanitarian workers? I mean, international law is very clear on this, right? You can't target civilians, and medical personnel especially are supposed to be protected.
Absolutely. And it gets even more complicated because the U.S. is Israel's main arms supplier. So they've got their own legal obligations to make sure their weapons aren't being used to break international law. It's a very messy situation with potentially huge implications.
Yeah, and then there's the whole issue of the mass grave where those 15 bodies were found, marked with an ambulance light. The head of the UN's humanitarian agency called it an absolute horror.
It's just tragic all around. And this comes after Israel ramped up their military campaign again on March 18th after those ceasefire talks fell apart. The Hamas-run health ministry says over 1,000 people have been killed just since then.
It's hard to wrap your head around the scale of the violence there. Over 50,000 dead since the conflict started after that Hamas attack back in October of 2023.
It's just a devastating situation, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better.
Okay, switching gears back to the U.S., there's this case at Cornell University that's drawing a lot of attention. A graduate student, Momadou Tal, had his visa revoked because of his involvement in protests against Israel.
Yeah, Tal's is a citizen of both the UK and Gambia. He actually sued to try and stop the deportation, But in the end, he decided to leave the U.S. on his own. He said he was worried about his safety and, being able to speak his mind freely.
It's a tough call, but I can understand why he felt like he had to leave. It sounds like things are getting pretty tense for anyone who's openly critical of Israel.
It's definitely a trend we're seeing. The Trump administration's been cracking down on international students who take part in anti-Israel protests. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said they've revoked at least 300 student visas, citing the Immigration and Nationality Act, which lets them deport non-citizens who they see as a threat to foreign policy or national security.
But isn't that a pretty slippery slope? I mean, where do you draw the line between legitimate protest and being a threat to national security? It starts to feel like a way to silence dissent.
That's exactly what a lot of critics are saying. They're arguing that this is a violation of free speech rights. And when you look at Talal's case specifically, he posted stuff online supporting armed resistance in Palestine, even on the day of the Hamas attack. You can see how that would make some people nervous.
Right, but it also raises questions about how far the government can go in restricting speech, especially when it comes to students.
It's a complex issue for sure. And it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out legally.
Well, let's move on to something a bit more domestic. We had some pretty wild weather in the central U.S. over the weekend. Storms, tornadoes, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, over 73 million people were under threat on Sunday, and the National Weather Service was putting out all kinds of warnings about tornadoes, huge hail, and torrential rain.
I saw some crazy videos online. Did any particular states get hit harder than others?
Well, Michigan's got over 300,000 people without power right now, and between Wisconsin and Indiana, there's another 100,000 in the dark.
Ouch, that's going to take a while to get sorted out. Any idea how long this crazy weather is going to stick around?
They're saying the storms could last until Thursday, so a few more days of battening down the hatches.
All right, well, let's hope everyone stays safe out there. Okay, on the international front, things seem a little frosty between the U.S. and Russia after some comments President Trump made about Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, Trump's been pretty vocal about his displeasure with Putin lately,
Hmm.
but the Kremlin's been downplaying the whole thing, trying to keep a cool head.
So what exactly set Trump off this time?
Well, Putin suggested setting up an interim government in Ukraine and basically questioned Zelensky's credibility. Trump didn't take kindly to that and even threatened to slap some tariffs on Russian oil.
So not exactly a love fest between the two leaders, and I guess those talks they were having about the war in Ukraine aren't going so smoothly either.
Yeah, definitely hit a snag there.
Yeah.
And it's not just Putin's comments that have got Trump riled up. Some of the pro-Kremlin media over in Russia have been criticizing Trump for not stopping Ukraine from attacking their energy infrastructure,
So everyone's pointing fingers.
pretty much. And the Kremlin's even claiming that some of the stuff Trump said in that NBC interview was taken out of context or paraphrased, as they put it.
Right, so more fuel for the fire. Okay, let's move on to Zimbabwe, where they had a national protest calling for President Mnangagwa to step down.
Yeah, this is a big one. A nationwide call for Mnangagwa's resignation. But it turned into a bit of a shutdown, with most people staying home because of the heavy police presence.
So not a lot of people actually marching in the streets.
Not really. There was a small group, led by war veterans, accusing Mnangagwa of corruption and, basically clinging to power. But they got dispersed by the police pretty quickly.
And what about Mnangagwa? Is he addressing any of this?
He's in his final term right now, but there's this rumor that he's cooking up a plan to extend his rule past the constitutional limit.
So ignoring term limits, that's a bold move.
Yeah, it's not going over well.
No.
A lot of the protesters are backing the vice president, Chiwenga, as a replacement, but the government denies there's any rift between Mnangagwa and Chiwenga.
But people are clearly unhappy with the status quo.
Definitely. Businesses were closed, streets were empty, schools were shut down, even public transportation was scarce. They basically brought the country to a standstill.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. And what about the police? How are they handling all this?
They're out in force, with roadblocks, patrols, you name it. They even used tear gas in Harar to break up some of the crowds. There's definitely a lot of tension in the air right now.
Okay, back in the U.S., we've got more controversy brewing over deportations to El Salvador. The Trump administration just sent back 17 more people, they say, are gang members.
Yeah, this is despite some legal challenges that have been popping up. This group is supposed to include members of Tren de Aragua and MS-13, a mix of Venezuelans and Salvadorans.
So they're basically sidestepping that earlier court order that halted deportations under the Alien Enemies Act.
Exactly. They're saying these deportations are happening under general immigration laws.
And what's the justification for sending these people back?
Secretary of State Marco Rubio says they're murderers and rapists, but he didn't give any specifics.
And is El Salvador okay with taking them back?
Well, President Bukele actually posted a video of the deportees being processed into prison. He claims they're all high-profile criminals, including child rapists. Apparently, El Salvador agreed to take them in exchange for $6 million.
So there's a financial incentive for El Salvador to cooperate. But what about the families of the deportees? Do they have anything to say about these claims?
Some families from earlier deportations say their loved ones have no ties to gangs, and the legal fight over using the Alien Enemies Act is still ongoing.
Okay, let's switch gears to the economy. How are global markets reacting to all this talk about U.S. tariffs?
It's a mixed bag, really. U.S. shares actually bounced back a bit, but things aren't looking so rosy in Asia and Europe. They're getting hit hard by worries about these new tariffs that President Trump's been talking about. He's hinting that they could affect everyone.
Everyone. So not just those targeted tariffs on things like aluminum, steel, cars, and, well, basically everything from China.
Right. And that's got everyone on edge about a potential global trade war. I mean, the UK, the EU, and Canada are all talking about retaliating with their own tariffs.
Yeah, that could get ugly fast. How's this uncertainty playing out in the markets?
Well, the S&P 500's taken a pretty big hit, down almost 10% since the middle of February, its worst month in a while. And the Nasdaq's down over 10% this quarter, the worst it's been since 2022.
So a lot of nervousness out there. Any idea when we'll know more about these tariffs?
Trump's supposed to make an announcement on April 2nd, but things could always change. It wouldn't be the first time he's switched things up on tariffs.
So buckle up, folks. It could be a bumpy ride. Okay, moving on. There's a case out of Cyprus that's generating a lot of controversy. 5 Israeli men were acquitted of all charges related to an alleged gang rape of a British woman.
Yeah, this is a pretty high-profile case. The woman, who's 20 years old, claims she was gang raped back in September of 2023.
So what happened? Why were the men acquitted?
The court basically said the woman's testimony wasn't credible enough. They said there were too many inconsistencies and weaknesses in how she identified the men and what she said happened.
So they didn't believe her story.
Not entirely, no. They said, while it's not unusual for people to misidentify their attackers in these kinds of situations, her testimony just had too many contradictions. Like, she said she was dragged from a party with like 100 people, but her friend who was there said that didn't happen. And she claimed she was shouting for help, but people in the next room said they didn't hear anything.
So they didn't buy the details of her story.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of her being intoxicated. The lab tests showed she had a lot of alcohol and drugs in her system.
But being intoxicated doesn't mean she consented.
That's true, and the court acknowledged that. But they also said they couldn't definitively link the abrasions on her body to the alleged assault.
So a lot of unanswered questions.
Definitely. And it sounds like part of the trial was held behind closed doors, which always adds another layer of complexity to these kinds of cases.
Okay, let's move on. We have some tragic news coming out of Lithuania. 3 U.S. soldiers who had been missing for 6 days were found dead in a swamp.
Yeah, it's a really sad story. They were part of a military exercise over there and went missing while trying to recover a tactical vehicle that had gotten stuck.
So how did they end up in a swamp?
The vehicle they were using to tow the other one, it was a big recovery vehicle called an M88A2 Hercules, ended up submerged in a bog. They found it on March 26th, and it took a huge search and rescue operation with both U.S. and Lithuanian forces involved to even locate it.
And they're still searching for the 4th soldier.
Yes, that's right. They haven't given up hope yet, but it's obviously a very difficult and dangerous search. They had to bring in Navy divers who had to work in zero visibility just to attach cables to the submerged vehicle so they can pull it out. And then they needed all this heavy equipment and tons of gravel to actually get it out of the bog. It was a massive effort.
It's just heartbreaking. And how are people reacting to this tragedy?
There was a mass held in Vilnius, attended by soldiers, commanders, and Lithuania's defense minister. And the Lithuanian president offered his condolences to the U.S. It's a reminder of the risks that soldiers face every day, even during training exercises.
Absolutely. Okay, switching gears again, there was a deadly explosion at a mine in Spain.
Yeah, this happened at the Cerrado mine in Degaña, which is in the Asturias region in northern Spain.
Yeah.
At least 5 people were killed.
Do they know what caused the explosion?
The initial reports just said there was a problem with the machine, but they're still investigating. 4 other people were injured, and thankfully, 2 who were initially reported missing were later found safe.
And what kind of mine was it?
It used to be a major anthracite mine, but it closed down in 2018. They were using it intermittently for extracting minerals to make graphite.
So a terrible accident, and sadly, these kinds of mining incidents aren't all that uncommon.
No, they're not. And it's a reminder of the dangerous conditions that miners often face.
All right, let's go back to the situation in Gaza. The Red Cross is speaking out about the killing of several Palestinian medics and aid workers.
Yeah, this is that incident we talked about earlier where those vehicles were struck by Israeli forces. It turns out 8 Palestinian medics, 6 civil defense responders, and a UN staffer were killed.
So even more casualties than initially reported? That's just awful.
The Red Cross is outraged, and rightfully so. 5 ambulances, a fire truck, and a UN vehicle all hit one by one, as they put it. The Palestine Red Crescent Society says they're still missing another one of their medics and accused Israel of deliberately targeting their staff.
But the Israeli military claims they thought those vehicles were suspicious, right?
That's what they're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
They said they didn't have lights or signals and were advancing suspiciously. But the Red Cross isn't buying it. They're saying these vehicles were clearly marked and that there's no way this was an accident.
And what about those 15 bodies that were recovered from the mass grave? Were they all aid workers?
Sounds like it, yeah. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies identified their 8 medics who were killed, and the UN confirmed that one of their staff members was among the dead.
So another tragic loss of humanitarian workers, and the UN humanitarian chief said they found the bodies in a mass grave marked by an ambulance light. That's just chilling.
It really is. The Red Cross is calling it a potential war crime, and the UN is demanding a full investigation.
Okay, let's move on to something a little lighter, at least in terms of subject matter. We've got some drama unfolding in the world of Korean entertainment. Kim Soo-hyun, the actor, just addressed those allegations made by the family of actress Kim Se-ron, who passed away in February.
Yeah, this has been all over the news in Korea. The family's been making some pretty serious accusations against Kim Soo-hyun.
Like what?
They're saying he dated Kim Se-ron when she was underage, only 15 years old, and that his agency pressured her to repay a loan.
See, some pretty damaging claims.
Yeah.
How's Kim Soo-hyun responding?
He completely denies it. He says he did date her for a year, but only when she was an adult, never when she was a minor. And he says the loan thing was just a standard procedure, nothing shady going on.
So a case of he said, she said.
Basically, yeah. But there's alleged chat history from when she was 16 that the family's lawyer released. And Kim Soo-hyun's agency initially denied they ever dated, then changed their story and said it happened between 2019 and 2020.
So some inconsistencies there.
Yeah, and it's all playing out under this intense scrutiny that celebrities in Korea face, especially when it comes to their romantic relationships. Plus, Kim Se-ron had that drink driving incident back in 2022, which brought a lot of negative attention her way.
Right, so there's a lot of baggage here.
Definitely. And Kim Soo-hyun's trying to clear his name. He even released a voice recording that supposedly backs up his version of events. But several brands have already distanced themselves from him, and one of his shows on Disney Plus has been put on hold.
So a lot at stake for him.
For sure. And it's not over yet. His lawyers filed a criminal complaint against the family and a civil lawsuit for damages. So we'll have to see how it all plays out in court.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about that $1 million giveaway that Elon Musk just pulled off in Wisconsin.
Yeah, this is quite a stunt. He handed out checks for $1 million to voters right before the state Supreme Court election.
$1 million. Just like that.
Well, not to everyone, of course. He said the money was for people who signed a petition against what he called activist judges.
So, trying to sway the election.
The Wisconsin Attorney General definitely thought so. They sued to try and stop the giveaway, arguing that it violated state law against bribing voters.
And what happened?
The lower courts sided with Musk, saying it was protected political speech, and then the state Supreme Court refused to even hear the case.
So Musk got away with it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And both he and President Trump endorsed the conservative candidate, Judge Brad Schimmel, who was running against Judge Susan Crawford, who had the backing of the liberal justices.
So a high-stakes election with a lot of money flying around.
Absolutely. And this election's being seen as a kind of test for how much support there is for Trump's second term, and it's coming right before some big court cases on issues like abortion rights, redistricting, and voting rules.
So a lot riding on this one election.
For sure. And Musk's been framing it as a chance to stop redistricting that favors Democrats. He even donated $14 million to Schimmel's campaign.
Wow, $14 million. That's a lot of faith in one candidate.
Yeah, and it's not the first time Musk's done something like this. He's offered cash prizes to voters in other states for supporting things like the First and Second Amendment rights.
So using his wealth to influence politics.
It's definitely a controversial strategy, but it seems to be working for him so far.
All right, we've got one more story to cover before we wrap things up. A U.S. surgeon who just spent 3 weeks working in Gaza is painting a pretty grim picture of the situation there.
Yeah, this is Dr. Mark Perlmutter. He's been speaking out about the lack of medical supplies and how it's leading to preventable deaths.
So what exactly is he saying?
He said he was operating without basic things like soap, antibiotics, even X-ray facilities. And he was seeing tons of wounded children, like a 15-year-old girl who'd been hit by machine gun fire.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And Dr. Perlmutter's been pretty critical of Israel's actions, even calling for an arms embargo against them.
But Israel says they're just trying to rescue their hostages.
That's their stated goal, yeah. But Dr. Perlmutter says the reality on the ground is very different. He worked at Al-Aqsa Hospital and Nasser Hospital, and he believes the conditions there are a violation of the Geneva Convention. He gave some really graphic descriptions of the injuries he saw, especially among children.
And what does the Israeli military have to say about all this?
They maintain that they don't target civilians and that they operate according to international law. They say they only hit military objectives and that they do everything they can to minimize harm to civilians.
But it's hard to square that with the accounts we're hearing from people like Dr. Perlmutter.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated situation with conflicting narratives.
Okay, one last item for today. There's a special congressional election happening in Florida to fill that seat vacated by Michael Waltz.
Right, and it's shaping up to be a pretty tight race. The Democratic candidate, Josh Weil, thinks he can flip the seat, while the Republican, Randy Fine, is warning that a Democratic win would mean putting the brakes on President Trump's agenda.
So a lot at stake for both parties.
Absolutely. And this district went hard for Trump in November, like over 30 points. But Wiles managed to raise a lot more money than Fine, and some polls even have him ahead.
So the Republicans are sweating a bit.
You could say that. They've got big names like Trump himself and Elon Musk's political committee throwing their weight behind Fine, but special elections can be unpredictable.
Yeah, sometimes it just comes down to which side is more fired up.
Exactly. And if the Democrats manage to pull this one off, it would seriously shrink the Republican majority in the House.
All right, well, that's a wrap for today. We covered a lot of ground, from natural disasters to political upheavals, humanitarian crises, and economic uncertainties. It's a lot to take in, but it's important to stay informed about what's happening in the world, both near and far. So thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with more news and analysis. Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.